Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update. First part there for the 4th of December 2024. It's the second time I recorded this video because I'm stupid. I didn't say this yesterday, and this is a digression. I had my videos yesterday afternoon done a little bit later, and it's because I live on a very quiet road. And it's typical suburbia on the south coast of the UK. I was just walking out my front door and I heard a big old bang from like 5 doors up the road. A car had flipped. It was driving down the road, flipped onto its roof. Someone inside, moans coming out from out the car. Some other neighbours rushed to the car. I waddled over and helped as I could. 91-year-old driver had hit a car, or clipped, or gone into the wheel arch of a parked car, and then possibly sort of gone across and hit the curb on the other side, and it flipped the car. He said he was going 20 miles an hour. And actually, you know, you think, oh, that's rubbish. You're never going to flip a car like that. Speaking to police, actually, that can happen quite easily if all the right variables in place. The car flipped, and actually, it was right next to the car it impacted, and shoved that to the side, and it was on its roof there right next to it, so it couldn't have had that much momentum. Absolutely incredible. Anyway, this 91-year-old man was upside down, minor injuries, glass everywhere, the car's upside down, and we couldn't get him out. And you know, in the end, 4 fire and rescue trucks turned up, so 4 crews, 2 police cars, an ambulance. They ended up cutting the back seats of the car out from the boot. They opened the boot down onto the ground, cut out with those big pneumatic cutters, and then cut the passenger seat out. And they were inside the car. Then they lowered him safely because he was not in a good way. 91. I don't think he'll be driving again. And then they undid his seatbelt but he was upside down for a good half an hour, and then put him on a stretcher, got him out, oxygen and all that, and then put him in the ambulance and took him away, and we were given statements and everything. Incredible. Yeah, so that was a little bit of a diversion from my normal output yesterday, but I forgot to mention that, which is quite bizarre considering it was a major thing. Wow, just a car flipped on its roof, and poor old 91-year-old Philip was not in a good way. Anyway, Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before: 1,670 personnel loss, incredibly high number yet again. 7 tanks, I think that's a high number, even though it's a tad below the daily average. I think contextually at this time of the war, they are struggling for tanks, is my guess. Even though some days we've seen 20, but I think in general, that is a pretty good number for the Ukrainians. Likewise, 31 troop-carrying AFVs, although it's quite a bit over the daily average of about 20, that is a high number for this stage of the war, I think, as well. 26 artillery systems above the daily average, and 1 anti-aircraft warfare system. 80 vehicles and fuel tanks, very high in that category, which is not untypical, and 1 piece of special equipment. Now, a few things to note. Looking at Dell's stats, and I was chatting about this in my first version of this video, there's 1 anti-aircraft warfare system. I do get a sense that we haven't seen anti-aircraft warfare systems so much recently. Let's make that a little bit smaller because my stupid face is in the way. Yeah. So ignore this orange line that's going up there, because what happens, Dell Stats, he's brilliant. He compiles the data, and then you look at the additions and you think, oh, that's a huge number, or that's a low number, or whatever, and you put it here. But then there was this day back on the 30th of November where you can see here 13 anti-aircraft warfare systems. It was listed as 0 on that day. But what Dell was doing is saw what the number was the day before, and then saw what the number was the next day. So it actually jumped in the anti-aircraft warfare system up 13. So it went from 1006 to 1019, but actually only added 0 for that day. So he's added 13, but put it in red because they didn't lose 13 on that day, but they must have done some analysis and got some retrospective stuff in and confirmation of things that were blown up then or whatever, and changed the statistics. So, very occasionally you get these times when the stats change. If you remember, there was a day when 99 pieces of special equipment were added but 0 vehicles and fuel tanks, and we're discussing that was probably just a typo. They put it in the wrong column, and as a result they appeared to have rejigged it on that day as well. So a number of these stats were rejigged on that day. But ignoring that particular day where they had 13, so assume that was 0, you can see that actually, so the blue line are total numbers of air defense systems taken out. And when it's steeper, the blue line is steeper. It means that there are more losses. Higher numbers of losses give you a steeper total. It goes up at higher rates, right? And if it's shallower, then you are losing fewer bits of kit. So you can see here, there were hardly any lost at that period, or air defense systems lost in this period. And so it's almost flat, right? Very few additions to the grand total there. And then it gets really steep. And this is around the time of the counteroffensive in May 2023, when the Russians absolutely hammered the Ukrainians in terms of minefields, ATGMs, helicopters, and all sorts, artillery, mortars. And the Ukrainians took stock and said, actually, we need to really take out air defense systems. And you started seeing them systematically going for air defense systems. And we noted that at the time. That was one of our observations, that actually there was a real concentration on air defense systems. So you can see that not only is there a greater density of orange around here to suggest that they're taking out air defense systems on a regular basis every day, there were numbers, but also the numbers were high on a fairly consistent basis too. And then it kind of dropped down to a fairly constant level there, but you can see that the orange at the bottom was fairly densely there is a density of the orange here. And then we had certain kind of spikes where things were a little bit funkier. And then now you look at the last couple of months, really since the beginning of September, actually the density of orange has really dropped off. There are these occasional days where you get, 8 in one day, 7 on another day, but generally they are the stats are much lower. So the question is, why are there fewer air defense systems being lost by the Russians on a daily basis? My hope and my speculation would be that there are just fewer of them. The Ukrainians haven't had a degraded capability of finding and destroying those air defense systems. They still have the same ability. In fact, you could argue they've got a greater ability because their drone abilities are improving, both in range and capabilities. And they are still able to hit with HIMARS. They're still able to hit with artillery. You would have thought there's no significant change there. So this, I would assume, this is because there are fewer targets. Air defense systems are thinner on the ground for the Russians, which is what you would expect, given that they've lost 1,020 over about 1,000 days. So are they able to replace air defense systems at one a day? No, they aren't. They can't build them that quickly. In fact, I don't know what the stats are, but I'm pretty sure that they are way, way off building air defense systems at that rate. In fact, I think it's one of the categories they really struggle with building, if they are at all. So each air defense loss they have is going to affect their ability to position air defense pieces. It's that blanket that's too small for the bed analogy that I always give you. And that blanket is getting smaller and smaller, and the bed is staying the same size, right? So they have, they've still got the same area of land. In fact, arguably, the bed is getting bigger because they're taking more land. So it's just a real problem for the air defense coverage of the occupied parts of Ukraine, but also back into Russia. And I think we are starting to see a degradation of the air defense capacity throughout Russia and occupied Ukraine, to the point where you're wondering whether the Ukrainian Air Force can start getting closer and closer to the contact line, or have Ukraine just become worse at taking out air defense systems. I don't know. That's up to you to decide. Right, we go on to 2 days worth of Andrew Perpetua stats, and we're going to look at, first of all, here, the total numbers. This is from 2 days ago. where we have the personnel losses have been tracked at 128 there, so that's a pretty significant number over the average daily average that Andrew Perpetua has for his visually confirmed losses. He also talks about how in this list he'd been counting small parts of Magyar's video. Magyar occasionally brings out a video that just has an absolute ton. It's like a montage. He's the guy that has the drone unit. Absolute beast of a video often that is just a montage of dozens and dozens of things getting destroyed. And so then Andrew and his team have to work through that to add these to the list. And it's not that all of that stuff would have taken place over the last day or couple of days. That might have been weeks or maybe even a month worth of stuff, but you kind of put it on the stats anyway, and you just hope that it kind of averages itself over the time of Magyar doing that. Okay, so when we look at the total numbers of pieces of equipment, we look at a ratio of about 1 and 1 1/3 to 1, maybe. So much closer to parity there. Let's look at the Ukrainian losses. The combat asset losses are broadly similar, maybe 1.5 to 1 combat asset losses. Ukrainians losing a fair few APCs and MRAPs here. An air defense system, Strela 10, being damaged. A couple of bits of artillery, including damaged M777. Quite bad at when you look at the irretrievable losses for the Ukrainians in APCs and MRAPs. They are losing most of those destroyed and abandoned APCs. A lot of M113s, a few Humvees, and Senator and whatnot. For MRAPs, we've got about 7 here, I think. Most of those destroyed, abandoned, or captured. A couple of captured MRAPs are Kirpi, that's the Turkish provided mine-resistant ambush protection vehicle, and then the Kozak. Probably that would be happening in Kursk. Trucks, civilian vehicles, quite a few civilian vehicles there for the Ukrainians. And then we'll go and look at the Russian losses. Not massive difference between the numbers here, but there are some high, the numbers are higher for the Russians, just not hugely. We've got a boat, a couple of pieces of artillery. We have half dozen tanks. So the proportion of abandoned and destroyed to damaged, irretrievably lost to damage, is pretty good for the Ukrainians here. If you look at that, almost all of them are lost for good. We only have 3 IFVs and an AFV that are damaged. Otherwise, everything else is lost. Okay, tanks. So a bit of a range of tanks. Not too many tanks. Half dozen there. So a track guard and shed thrown in. Infantry fighting vehicles. Most of those taken out for good. BMPs 2s, 3s, BTRs, etc., etc. APCs, MTLBs. There are also a few MRAPs today for the Russians. Don't usually see too many mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles. Some 3 VPK Urals, all lost for good. And then we have another fairly significant number of trucks, a couple of ATVs, 4-wheeler quads, and civilian vehicles being taken out there. So that was 2 days ago, and we'll see if there is any difference here for yesterday's stats. So we'll see that the ratio is about 1.5 to 1, maybe 2 to 1. Total probably about 1 2/3 to 1. That's my guess. And as far as combat asset losses are concerned, probably the same statistic there for the ratio. We have 118 personnel lost. So again, another day of over 100 over the average there for Andrew Perpetua. When we look at the Ukrainian losses, there is a counter-battery radar. Difficult to know without looking at the source there as to whether that is a big piece of kit. Probably something just on the back of a... I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but it might not be that valuable, but it could be pretty valuable too. We have an abandoned Leopard 2A6 hit by a Vandal drone. That's going to hurt the Ukrainians a bit. That's a decent tank, one of their best tanks. Infantry fighting vehicles. In fact, if you look at the ratio of damaged to abandoned and destroyed, that's pretty good for the Ukrainians. Most things here are damaged, hardly any destroyed, a few abandoned, so that's good. Infantry fighting vehicles, just 4 of those, 3 tanks, including that Leopard 2, and then about a dozen APCs, Strikers, Humvees, VAB, that's a French one, Titan, and yeah, most of them damaged. We have a captured MRAP, another Kirby captured, a couple of trucks, an ATV, and a bunch of civilian vehicles there, pickup trucks, SUVs, cars, and whatnot. Not the worst day, but still losing quite a few APCs there. Now, the Russians having greater losses here, but mainly in terms of trucks and civilian vehicles. As far as combat asset losses, they've got an engineering vehicle, a UGV mine layer, that's an unmanned ground vehicle. Boats, 3 bits of artillery, including a destroyed Uragan, so that's a multiple launch rocket system, and a damaged Grad, also an MLRS. We have 7 tanks, most of them nondescript, a couple of T-80s. We have about 8 infantry fighting vehicles, range of those. Pretty good ratio of damage to destroyed in those 2 categories. APC slightly worse, most of those destroyed. MTLBs, and then quite a lot of trucks there for the Russians on that day. Might well be the Magyar's footage coming out. There seems to be a lot of night vision drone hits on those trucks there, and also civilian vehicles, quite a lot of those taken out as well. So nothing crazy valuable for either side, but consistent losses, really degrading both sides in terms of infantry fighting vehicles and APCs particularly. Okay, moving on to look at another data point. This one is, I think, pretty fascinating. So we've heard Mediazona and BBC Russia talk about the benchmark minimum of something like 81,000 Russian deaths. So that's the absolute minimum. It's hugely conservative, doesn't include LPR and DPR. You're going to have way more than that. But if that's your starting opening gambit, really. So we know that the minimum is 81,000. Now, we've had a mistake from Putin's niece, who's a deputy defense minister. So she accidentally revealed the approximate number of missing Russian soldiers. Russian authorities have received 48,000 DNA test requests to search for missing Russian soldiers, according to Anna Civileva, deputy defense minister and Putin's niece, during a statement in the State Duma. The head of the State Duma Defense Committee, Kartapolov, requested that, quote, these numbers not be mentioned anywhere else and that this information be removed from official documents. Ouch, so that accidentally came out. They're like, oh, we can't put this anywhere official. This is bad news. But this gives us an idea. We don't know that all missing people are dead, but we do know that most units appear to leave their troops lying around on the battlefield because A, it's dangerous to go and pick them up. B, they then have to report them as dead rather than MIA, and that looks worse for their commanders. And C, there then has to be the really high payments of compensation to the families, which you don't have to pay if they're MIA. So there are many good reasons that units and the MOD in general would prefer MIA to dead. So receiving 48,000 DNA tests means you would think there must be at least 48,000 people missing in action that they want or dead people that they want to be able to identify. So it could be that your absolute minimum is 81,000 plus 50,000 here. That's 130,000, and that's not including DPR and LPR and etc. etc. And so you're starting to get to a number that looks not too dissimilar from the Ukrainian General Staff figure, assuming, we're not assuming, we have been told that total number, 750,000 or 747,000, includes your killed, wounded, deserted, and POWs. So you put all those together, and with a wounded ratio of 3-1, actually you start getting to a figure that is somewhat justifiable. Okay, just sort of throw that one in. And then talking about prisoners of war, there's some pretty good hauls for the Ukrainians at the moment. A number of videos coming out now. I presume this is Kursk. I don't know that they'll be able to capture many Russians in other places on the front line when you're defending. You don't really capture people when you're defending. And it's a lot more dynamic up in Kursk. Now, this is fascinating. When I talk about the losses for the Russians being unsustainable, remember, it doesn't mean that they can't lose. It doesn't mean that the Russians, can't still take vast amounts of territory. Their losses are unsustainable, and they can take all of these fields in southeastern Donetsk and take these villages and towns. They can both be true. And it's because my definition of sustainable is you can't sustain doing what you are doing without making severe changes. You can't sustain doing that and remain in the same position in terms of like, right, we've taken 100 infantry fighting vehicle losses this month, but it's okay because we've built 100 infantry fighting vehicles, so we're still going to use the same amount of infantry fighting vehicles because we're replacing them at the exact numbers that we've used them, or maybe more, right? And if that's not happening, then we can't sustain doing what we're doing with these infantry fighting vehicles. So what we said, as I said, explained to you yesterday, we've seen instead of like well-trained Russian troops, you're getting convicts and conscripts and mercenaries from abroad and North Korea, 12,000 North Koreans. You're getting equipment from North Korea. You're getting deep storage bases being cleaned out of all of their equipment and having very little left. You're getting substandard vehicles, you're getting track garden sheds, you're getting this, you're getting that. These are all pointers towards the losses being unsustainable. You wouldn't be using these pieces of equipment or using these type of soldiers if you were able, if you didn't have to, right? And if you were able to sustain your behavior in the same way as you were behaving at the beginning of the war, then your losses would be sustainable. But you're not. You've changed behavior in all sorts of different ways, and this is unsustainable. And here is another example of how the Russian losses have been unsustainable, because you've got Russians here looking at a drone footage of their own troops, and you have a BMP being led across what I assume is a minefield, or at least a field, led by a cyclist, right? And these Russians are looking at it themselves going, what the F? Another unique case, a real breakthrough. Russian soldiers are watching as a Russian cyclist leads a Russian BMP into battle. Quote, imagine what the hohols, the Ukrainians, are thinking now, says one of the observers. So the Russians themselves can't believe this. Who's this guy? What's his call sign? Oh my goodness. Wondering if he's actually on a e-scooter. But either way, I mean, this is just absolutely insane. And again, you wouldn't be doing that. Like I said, you would if you could, you aren't, so you can't. So what do I mean by you would if you could? If you could, you would be using like 5 infantry fighting vehicles here, right? But instead, you're using one BMP being led by a cyclist, right? You would if you could, but you aren't, so obviously you can't, because there's no way you would say, oh, do you know what's the best thing for us to do today? Ivan, you get on a bicycle and you're going to lead the BMP, because actually that's optimal. That's the best way of attacking, is you cycling across a really difficult terrain on a bicycle to attack the enemy or to get from A to B. It's just, it's, I don't know what's going on there, but it's suboptimal for sure. Right. Now, here we have some footage of a Ukrainian strike on a Russian building where apparently there were militants who had assembled. 2 parts of the building are completely rubberized, and it shows you the power of these guided glide bombs. And remember, these are the Ukrainian ones. The Russians have ones that are like 3,000 kilograms, so like huge. When you see vast numbers of personnel lost, there will be times when the Russians are getting hit at these points of accumulation where the Ukrainians are probably going to be guesstimating how many people are in there and then adding them to list. I think I would have thought that that's what they do. Here we have a building that is struck. Let's get a sense of the building. So there you get this entire building. In that 2-story building here is rubberized, and 1-story building over here. I mean, this is what it looks like at the end. So the 1-story building over there largely reduced to rubble, and here the 2-story building likewise. And if there were large troop accumulations in both of those buildings, then that is going to hurt the Russians. But of course, the Russians do that frequently on the Ukrainians. The guided glide bombs are the scourge of certainly of the Ukrainians. The Russians use them so effectively. I'd like to know the stats, though. I would like to know if they're still using them to the levels that they have been previously, whether there's a drop in guided glide bomb usage. I don't know whether the Russians are less able to fly in the way that they were due to having threats to their air bases and moving their planes further back. And this means that there are strikes. The strikes are less frequent. Maybe they've lost more play. I don't know. I would like to know what the stats are and whether we have access to any such stats. Right, on distant strikes, Ukraine's Air Force reported another fairly significant wave of drones, 50. Not as big as we have seen, but still fairly sizable. 29 were shot down. 18 were suppressed by electronic warfare, so that's 47. One more in the direction of Russia, 48. So that leaves 2 that possibly hit their targets. I haven't heard anything about them. So we're going to go on to Ukrainian strikes. And there were 3 potential Ukrainian areas of strike last night, or at least 3. So one of them was Ryazan Oblast, where explosions were reported near to the Diaghilevo air base. So that's good news for the Ukrainians potentially, but we don't know about any of any detail there. Explosions in 3 areas, says Tim White. Here, Ryazan may have been more successful for Ukraine. The airbase came under attack, but the results are unknown. The other place is Novorossiysk. Now, Novorossiysk is where the Black Sea Fleet has been posted to, moved from Sevastopol, which is a deep sea warm water port, to the warm water port of Novorossiysk, but it's not that big, Novorossiysk, and they can't actually dock all the ships in the port area, so they had to moor them outside the port, which means they're much more vulnerable, but I think they have got a wide boom, and I don't know how effective these naval drones are anymore, because the booms broadly will stop them, and also the Russians have adapted in terms of machine guns and drone on drone, as in aerial drone, taking out the sea drones as well, from helicopter, operated from helicopters, all sorts. So there is adaptation that's gone on, and the last few times we've seen these drones get used, the targets have been smaller and smaller. We heard last night, so before I went to bed or went to sleep, there were reports of these drones on the way to Novorossiysk, which means that if that's coming out on open source intelligence, that's out on Twitter and Blue Sky, then the Russians are going to be knowing about that, which means they'll be preparing for them. So I don't know how effective this was. It might not have been effective at all, but there were certainly reports of explosions around there. So the port of Novorossiysk, where many of the Russian missile carriers hide, says Tim White, was attacked by drones. The local governor says all drones were shot down. There's no proof of damage. And the third place is actually in Chechnya, in Grozny. Target seems to have been the Kadyrov Special Police Regiment in Grozny. No casualties reported, but it could have been the ongoing internal dispute between Kadyrov and Dagestan. I mean, this is quite a long way for Ukraine to send its drones. A drone like that, I don't know. Anyway, the damage is not exactly huge, but the Ministry of Internal Affairs Special Forces Regiment there has been hit. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces, with the knowledge that more could have happened last night. It may or may not emerge throughout the day. So onto other bits and pieces. I just want to report that there were claims yesterday that it's true that cables were severed. Internet cables were severed between Finland and Sweden. This time on the land. There were rumours that it might well have been sabotaged, but actually we learn now that it's excavation that broke them, so it wasn't. I don't think it's anything to do with the Russian sabotage, just to let you know that. I almost reported that yesterday but didn't. I think I just lost the link or something. Right, War Translated says, known Russian channel considers that the exchange of any Russian territories, specifically Kursk, is not actually implied in the constitution, so the Kursk region will be recaptured by force, quote, no matter how many years it takes. It's interesting that the Russians have given themselves until the 20th of January, supposedly, Trump's inauguration, to take back Kursk. They don't want the Ukrainians to have that as leverage, to have that as a token on the table during any negotiations. They want to take Kursk back. This is one of their major objectives, and that's precisely why Ukraine are holding on to it so vigorously. You can argue whether that's a good idea or not, but they certainly are perceiving Kursk to be a huge reward, a huge bargaining chip of great value for the Ukrainians. Right, here we now hear that the mayor of the Ukrainian city of Dnepropetrovsk in Zaporizhia has died in Russian captivity, where he's been for 3 years, almost 3 years. So since the beginning of the war, this mayor was taken captive, and he's now been supposedly brutally tortured having life-threatening conditions, and he has died. That's Yevgeny Matveyev there. So sad news for him and his family. Now, another indicator that the Russians are taking unsustainable losses or they're in desperate straits for recruitment, both in Moscow, which is not somewhere you'd expect to see this. They kind of try and protect it seems, Moscow and St. Petersburg, because that's where the elites live. That's where the politicians and your students and so on and so forth. You start affecting the middle class and they might get, and the elites, and they might start getting a little bit uppity. In Moscow, whereas I presume people from the regions that are less enfranchised politically and less enfranchised, they don't have the power just in terms of all sorts of metrics. They are deemed, I presume, much more malleable, much more controllable by the Kremlin. And so actually, if we're going to recruit from anywhere, that's fine by me. Thank you very much. We get most of the people from Perpetua onto the front lines. It's not going to affect how everything's going in St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg and Moscow. Well, now we're starting to see forced recruitments in Moscow of students. And Pekka Kaliniemi saying in Moscow, the forced recruitments have started. They're desperately in need of new meat for the meat grinder. Referring to a video from Anna Komza saying raids of military recruitment offices against students in Moscow continue. The workers have left and now they're taking the students. So we see a kid taken out of his car and forced to the recruitment office. Then we have another video to support this as well. Muscovy, again from War Translated, Muscovy continues its crackdowns on young Russians eligible for conscription. For instance, officials tried to break into the apartment of a 22-year-old student, cutting off the electricity entirely. When he came out, they forcibly took him to a medical examination. Now, I don't know if this is to do with conscription. So Putin has recently raised the size of the Russian army by 180,000. Sounds like the army's getting bigger, but really that's just replacing what they've lost. So on paper it's getting bigger, but as we've heard, the amount of missing in action, they're going to still be on paper in the army, but they're likely dead. So I don't know whether these students or this particular person on camera, I think he intimates that it's to do with conscription, but they are going now to hit these sections of society that we haven't seen previously so much. So I think that is a change of behavior and indicates that Russia is struggling. Now, talking about struggling, we're just going to have a little thread on the economy here. So Tatarigami says, with Russia's budget deficit at 3.3 trillion rubles, 21% key interest rate, and 2 to 3 million job vacancies. Job vacancies means there's a labour shortage. They can't fill the posts. Weirdly, I've also heard that there is employment creeping up because certain big organizations are not hiring due to loads of economic indicators. So they're thinking, right, it's all going to tank. There's no point us taking on people. So there's movements going both ways there, potentially, but I'll need to find out where I was reading that. Anyway, Russia has to choose between hyperinflation and economic freeze, says Vladimir Milov, former Deputy Minister of Energy, in an interview with Intelligence Insight. Milov, an economist and longtime ally of Alexei Navalny, explains that the Russian markets are gloomy ahead of the central bank's board meeting on the 20th of December. The bank is expected to raise interest rates once again from 21% to maybe 23 or 25%. For central bank to continue interest rate hikes means that to kill the real sector of the economy, where most companies simply don't have sufficient profitability to borrow at current interest rates, which officially are 21%, but that translates into 25 to 30% commercial loan rates. So relaxing tight monetary policies and lowering interest rates would push Russia into hyperinflation territory. However, the elephant in the room, in the war, which is the root cause of all these problems, the war drives extreme military spending, which fuels inflation. Ruble depreciation will contribute to inflation even further as Russia continues to be heavily reliant on imports. So the devaluation of the ruble means that buying stuff in becomes more expensive. Exporting should be cheaper, but people aren't buying their stuff. No, people are sanctioning Russia, so you're not buying stuff from Russia. Apart from if you're like China and India, but my opinion would be they're probably trying to protect their market, so they won't let Russian general goods into China and India. But actually, we'll have your hydrocarbons very cheap, thank you. So the gas and your oil will be super cheap. Yeah, we'll have that because that underwrites our profitability as a nation. If we can get cheap energy, we can produce things cheaper and make things more cheaply. that's going to be good. So yeah, we'll have that, but we'll say no to your Russian cars or your Russian this or your Russian that, and that means that Russia's just been economically bent over the desk, and they are. It's really unfortunate. Well, it's not unfortunate. It's, from my point of view, it's what they deserve. They are in a really bad position economically. So ruble depreciation will continue contribute to inflation even further as Russia continues to be heavily reliant on imports while being under all sorts of embargoes, and China and other global south countries are not opening their markets to most Russian goods. And that's the point I was just making. When current revenues are insufficient to cover budget expenses, the state must find alternative sources to finance the deficit. In the current situation, Russia is cut off from international financial markets, cannot turn to Western governments or the IMF for assistance. In other words, we're in trouble. We need to borrow from outside the country. We can't do that because they won't lend to us. This is what Russia has typically done in deep systemic crisis. In the last years of the Russian Empire during World War One or the USSR during the 1980s, the government heavily borrowed money from the West, which prolonged the existence of the empire, but not for long. Now, this option is not available, and neither China nor other countries in the global south are interested in providing loans to Russia. China doesn't even agree to give a permit to the Russian government to issue yuan-nominated Russian state bonds. Russia can still borrow domestically, which it tries to do, but the high interest rates and the rising bond yields, 10 years OFZ bond auctions over 17%, it makes no sense. The government spends more on servicing the expensive debt than it raises through the OFZ bond placements. So the only option left is depleting the state's national reserves, the National Wealth Fund, whose liquidity portion is down to just 5.5 trillion rubles or $56 billion as of November the 1st. Now, with the depreciation of the ruble, then the reserves are worth less as well. It's a real double whammy. The budget deficit for 2024 is planned to reach 3.3 trillion rubles or 60% of the liquidity. Budget deficit will be 60% of the National Wealth Fund liquidity. The liquid National Wealth Funds. Wow. There are currently around 2 to 3 million job vacancies in the labour market, and the number is growing. Most industries, manufacturing, agricultural, logistics, retail, utilities, and IT report shortages of workers, measured in hundreds of thousands or 10 to 50% of the workforce. To give you an idea about how bad the labour market situation is, with reference to the discussion at the annual Russian Industrialist Forum held in St. Petersburg, they said one of the main ideas on how to ease labour shortage problem is hiring teenagers under 18 and pensioners to work. This is a key reason why Putin, contrary to many forecasts, hasn't called for a second wave of mandatory mobilisation since autumn 2022. It's not to say he can't do it, but this would be a disastrous hit for the labour market. It would be absolute economic suicide. To suddenly say, oh, and we need another 300,000 soldiers in a market where they're thinking about employing children and pensioners, you are going to just destroy your economy even more. There are no sources of good news for the Russian economy on the horizon, only bad news. War-driven inflation is not reacting to the central bank's interest hikes. By 2022, it's expected that Russia would be on its feet with import substitution, but none of this is happening. Putin may continue the present course for some time, but 2025 will be some kind of a moment of truth for him. The clock is ticking. We're not there yet, but at some point soon, Putin will have to seriously consider continuation of the war. And this is my biggest hope for Ukraine. The biggest hope is the economic collapse of Russia. That's something we need to make sure is expedited, and that's why the sanctions from the US are so freaking important. Now, moving the subject to Ukraine, 200 mental health centres have been launched there. Quote, we strive to create a network of mental health centres that will become a key link for people who need highly specialised help. So where you have a country that's been supported with lots of money coming in from the EU, from the US, from the UK, from Norway, Switzerland, Japan, Australia, etc., etc. All these countries support Ukraine with military aid, but importantly, other aid to keep the country going. They are able to set up stuff that they desperately need for their personnel. You are going to get one of the big scars, I think, for Ukraine going forward will be the scar in its national psyche. There will be psychological conditions that will proliferate right throughout society, from the military to the civilian, to adults to children. You will have people who are lacking education, but people who would have been torn apart, their families torn apart by death or just by terror, PTSD amongst the military, dealing with physical ailments, losing a leg, losing an arm, losing your sight, and then civilians likewise. Mental health will be such a challenge for Ukraine for a generation. And that they're thinking about that now and putting into place 200 mental health centers is massively important. But it's also probably a stark contrast to Russia. Russia will be generationally massively affected by this war. This war is just insanely bad decision for Putin to have decided on. Just insanely bad. And I don't think they're in a place to do things like that, which I think is reflective of the kind of support that they're not getting Russia. The support that Russia is getting is people like China and India saying, yeah, we'll buy your oil for cheap. We'll help you out, mate. I want that for cheap. It's like, you're forced into a corner. We're going to take advantage of you. You will be our vassal state to some degree. Whereas Ukraine, there will be exploitation going on. I mean, people are talking about this with an appeal to Trump, saying, well, there are rare earth metals that you'd rather you get hold of than Russia, blah, blah, blah. But there's this recognition that Ukraine is really important for us strategically, so we need to support it, because actually rather they fight than we fight. So actually we need to support them. It's not that we're going to exploit them, take things out of them. We just want them to win the war, because the winning of the war is the gain that we get, which means that Russia isn't attacking us. It's a very different way of seeing things. Like China, for China and India, it doesn't matter whether Russia win or lose a war. It doesn't really matter. Like, the end result is, meh, okay, Russia lost the war. What we want to make sure is that whether they win or lose, we get cheap natural resources from Russia. That's the most important thing. So we're not going to support Russia with like massive monetary loans and sort out their sovereign wealth fund or whatever it is, national wealth fund. That's not as important as us just screwing Russia for everything we can. Okay, moving on to my final thing here. I know it's been a long one. So I'm wearing this hat because I knew I was going to be talking about this. So the Peaky Blinders, one of the greatest series of modern times. Ukrainian Peaky Blinders drone unit has received authentic hats from Stephen Knight, who's the creator of the hit British TV show that the unit is named after. The hats were even signed by the star of the series, Cillian Murphy, who's a great actor. A Peaky Blinders unit is currently defending Ukraine on the front lines. You'll know Cillian Murphy maybe from Oppenheimer if you haven't seen Peaky Blinders. And 28 Days Later and other such films. In fact, wasn't he a great film, Anthropoid? Looked at the Czech partisan resistance. That's a great film. Was it him and Dornan? Is it Steve Dornan? Anyway, I digress. It's not Steve. This is the Peaky Blinders themselves, or at least in the TV series, and this is such a cool picture of the unit. I absolutely love this image. It is so cool. Just look at these guys. They just look cool as a cucumber. Hands in pockets, wry smiles. Yeah, there you go, Peaky Blinder unit. Awesome stuff. Anyway, I doff my hat. I tip my hat to you, good men of the Peaky Blinders unit. Take care, y'all, and I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.